Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode in the series of the Beezone's presentation of the 7 stages of life as taught by Adi Da Samraj.
Great one.
And one of the things that I would like to address first is that this is not an official Adidam, which is the Church of Adi Da.
Presentation
Or any relationship to that. Beezone is not associated with Adidam or the Church of Adi Da. And so we are both students, Frank Marrero, and myself, Ed Reether, former student of Adi Da and Adidam.
We're both lifelong students in our heart.
But as we both acknowledge, we can't find anything worth studying and being a student of. So
not in comparison.
Yeah. And so this particular session of the 7 stages of life that we've been presenting to you and through the Beezone is on the 3rd stage of life. And if you've been following with us, that we've covered the 1st stage, which is basically from 0 to 7 years old or thereabouts, and the beginning development of human development. But also, this is a cultural development. And then there's the 2nd stage of life, which goes from 7 to 14. Again, it's a general kind of context. And now we're into that period of adolescence, or the 3rd stage of life, which develops into adulthood or full maturity as a human being in a social context, which is, of course, a world context. So, Frank,
I want to add to your caveat. In traditional Buddhist Dharma talks, they would always begin with Evam, thus I've heard. And so that, this isn't stuff we thought of. That this is thus I have heard. And so everything that we have to say that even slightly insightful, this we have heard.
I think one of the things that you realize when you become a student of
an enlightened master,
or even a student of any discipline, is that you're not making this stuff up. I mean, this isn't coming out of your special little molecule of mind here.
So, we're just click and clack of Adidam, and so we want to dispel any presumptions that we're just we're school teachers, and so we like teaching this because it's the closest and dearest thing to us.
Okay.
So sorry.
All right. No. Sorry. This is good. This is a discussion. So Frank, if you were to describe the initial kind of concept or idea of the 3rd stage of life, how would you identify that?
Wow. Well, you used the word concept. So it is the onset of mind in and of itself, the way we generally talk about mind and concept. Let me give you a historical example. The ancient Egyptians noticed that the Nile flooded every year, and they wanted to then recover their land. And they didn't know how to say this is my boundary, because all the boundary markers would get washed away. So what they did is they figured out that if you take a rope and put knots in it at equal distance, and you made it 3 knots by 4 knots, and this one 5 knots, that would be a perfect right angle. And so then they could make marks above the flood line and make that's mine and that's yours. Now that's a precept. They understood it. They didn't understand it conceptually. And then Pythagoras came along, and he looked at it and went, oh, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, concept. So this precept to concept transition is a telling sign of that onset of that 3rd stage of life.
So I guess you might say it's the ability to abstract into thought.
Into what we call thought. Obviously, little kids think. When we say, in this particular stage of life, as we talk about it, when we use thought, we mean it like, not like kids thinking, oh, I wish I had a pet puppy. That's not the kind of thought. It's conceptual, abstract thought.
So it's like algebra.
Algebra, Right, exactly.
Right, okay. And so part of this development of mind, or the ability to abstract the precept or the perception of what
Previous life
previous life
and experience.
or really the physical world,
Physical and emotional. And emotional, but because there's some ideas, I mean, the whole thing becomes subjected to concept. But you're right, it's more dominant about physical than emotional.
Right.
For reasons we'll get into soon.
Right, because the third stage starts from the movement out of the second and previous first stage, because we're not cutting off the first stage, going to the second stage, cutting off that next level and moving to the next level.
Right, exactly.
This is an integrated bodily teaching about
Bodily,
whole
chronic, emotional.
body awakening to a principle that is prior to and beyond all of this thinking, feeling, and being, body, mind.
Right on. So in the first stage, we awaken, as adults, we take responsibility for the first stage and we can rest in God, bodily. In the second stage, in the fulfillment of that, we let our feelings go without neurotic pullbacks, so that we can rest our feeling in God, in the greater, in the foundation in the greater energy, and in the third stage, we again, this is not in other words, a developmental up. We're going to talk about how Adi Da talks about how we can then now integrate the thinking mind and the capacity of being smarty pants into the all-pervading life consciousness. So each of these, they're not in and of themselves. They are, like you said, they're happening within a the great context.
And I think one of the things that Adi Da talks about, he talks about the functional responsibility of the frontal personality. And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit. What do you mean by frontal personality?
Well, Adi Da talks about the frontal yoga, and when the feeling or the experience or the sensitivity to life spirit, the all-pervading life spirit, the life that is everywhere, you start to experience that. He talks about it as it coming down, and first it comes down the face relaxes, and then the throat relaxes, and then the emotion of being part of the being relaxes, and then the intent is clear, and then all the perturbations of your emotional life uncoil, and then and the fulfillment, as it were, of that frontal personality is all the way at the base, back to the first stage orientation of the complete relaxation of the perineum. Now, as abstract, incomplete third stage, we might think that, oh, okay, let's see, relax my face, relax my shoulder, okay, I'm really doing it now. And that's not it. It's, can you feel, without abstraction, the depth of gratitude? Can you trust? So that descent of the frontal personality is something that we're going to develop as third stagers by a process of mind and intent, which are related. You understand something? Ah, I want it.
So just to stay with the body, now the third stage of life is really central to what's called the vital centers of the body, which is basically the navel, or the intention of what today we call the core, because it's really about the base of this frame here, which is the navel center, which is connected to the brain centers of higher mind and will and intention. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about the distinction. What's will and intention?
And just to follow up, you're talking about this mirroring around the heart. So in the second stage, you have the genital, sexual, and that's so right, or, that's in the mind and the will are, there's a mirroring, there's a correlation between those two. So, and when you understand something, then your will awakens. You don't. I mean, we're not talking about a willful 2-year-old. We're talking about real will, the capacity for intention. The capacity for intention is based, or the expression of the understanding. So they go together. It's not one than the other. So will has to be developed in the third stage of life. So they're given great tasks. Schooling becomes very different, and we have there's dozens or hundreds of small G gurus out there saying you've just got to imagine it and go for it. Yes, you are what you think, and just think it, and they'll magically appear. And it's a lesser concept. It's they're small G for sure, gurus, but it definitely has to be done. We do have to develop the capacity to be focused, to be one-pointed.
And so one of the key elements in this will or development of intention is discriminative intelligence. To be able to discriminate in the maze of now what's developing as mind. Because part of this is you have the dream mind, you have the reveries, you've got fantasies, you've got all sorts of conceptual. Now you've got to figure things out.
Right, because those things you just said were more second stage mind, but they're still present, and so you do have to adapt and develop mind, and of course the word sophomoric comes to mind. You know, you think you know, oh, I've got it now, and everybody knows. I've never taught teenagers for just this reason. I teach adults in college and fifth graders right before this I know everything takes over. So that has to be developed. The capacity of mind has to be developed. The onset of that is what can be called cleverness. You really understand things in a way that is not mythic. One of my historical and prime examples is Odysseus. He's the one that figured out the Trojan horse. And so, because all the other people are going, oh, look, the gods have sent us a good gift. That's mythic thinking. That's second stage and magical first stage thinking. And Odysseus was not limited. He was certainly more developed, and that's why he was the hero of the Trojan War, because he came up with a clever, beyond mythic, beyond magic and mythic thinking that penetrated the wall. So it could be, it wasn't done just by vital force. It wasn't done by mythic force. In fact, those are then subjected by the clever mind. So the onset of this mind development, this is a kind of cleverness, but as we'll get to later, that has its own dark side. So, but then nevertheless, that cleverness is a kind of a discrimination. But as the word sophomoric implies, it's not sufficient. And so it continues to develop so that the capacity for understanding even your own sophomoricness develops, so that that continues to grow, beginning with clever, sophomoric, I know everything kind of things, to, oh, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe, you know, this is a better concept, or this is a higher concept, and oh, don't you see that? And so that rarefication and subtleties develop into what we could call discriminative intelligence at the beginning of it.
So, without the development of discriminative intelligence, then one's development most likely will stay in a previous level of adaptation. There's this thing in the teaching of Adi Da says is that if you don't adapt to something, you can't transcend it. You can't go beyond it, because this is really about going beyond something. So if you don't develop discriminative intelligence, if you don't develop mind, if you don't develop will and intention, then your understanding will be in a lesser or a previous level of adaptation, which
myopia,
which was corresponding either to a pre-verbal unconscious state of either first stage development or a dream-like state of a second stage feeling dimension, where you don't have the idea of what is happening. You're just lost in the feeling. So one of the things that this third stage is characterized by is the feeling of independence, but yet still dependent.
Right.
So we have this kind of struggle, or I guess one of the
oscillation,
or one word that keeps on repeating itself in Adi Da's teaching is called dilemma.
right?
Which is kind of this Chinese torture, as you kind of pointed out.
Well, remember in the first two stages of life, the background mood was dependence. Mommy, can I have it? You know, what do you think about this, Dad, what I made? All that kind of, there's a background mood of dependence. Now, with the onset of the third stage of life, the feeling of independence comes about in a new way, not the independence of the little kid, but a new, true, the autonomy of the self, my ideas. There's a kind of an independence there.
From mother and father and family.
And friends even, you know, the elementary age ideas, to, oh, I can look at everything and think about my ideas, and I'm no longer mythic in the way Odysseus was. And so there's this sense of independence. But, as Adi Da points out, there's not even a molecule of wood in this wall that is independent. Mm-hmm. It's just a sensation that people take to be real. And so, as you try to be independent, which is good, you want to do that, you're deluded by that, and then functionally it doesn't work. Hey, I'm taking off tonight. Mom, can I have the car keys? Dad, can I get $20 for gas? So there's still this, there is no true independence.
Right.
And you are confronted with that functionally as well as or internally. So as you oscillate between independence and dependence, you are torn between those two, and that becomes a dilemma. Mm-hmm. So the background mood of the third stage of life is not dependence, and it's not independence, it's dilemma, which kind of drives it to the heart of all of us in some ways. You know, the sense you have of dilemma, oh, look at this, well, yeah, but this, that is a sign of the developing third stage.
So the third stage is the struggle of integrated self-presentation. And so there is a sense of a separate individual, but it's not separated out. You're actually integrating your individuality. There is individuality,
Of course.
but there's not separateness. There's not a independent, self-motivated, only by me kind of presentation to the world. You now integrate, you're moving from mother, father, sibling, family, to now and cultural integration. And the real test of a third stage development is to be integrated. So you must assimilate, you must integrate into the larger culture, right, which hopefully is one that will give you some wisdom in your heroic journey to
ordinary human maturity, which never happens, by the way, in case you might have noticed. You would hopefully be doing that, but it almost never happens.
Meaning that there is no ideal
cultural setting,
cultural perfect place that you are going to find your nirvana by your own independent will. Because that's what's this now, the dilemma is that. Because now as you go out, there is this kind of understanding that you're not just a separate individual, you're integrated.
Right. Now, this capacity for separation makes great science. I mean, you look at something, well, what would you make postulates? Well, if I did this and I kept this control, and it develops great science. So one of the advantages of separativeness, this I'm inside my mind and I can look and think about everything, function, is that you make great science and things get very real. Scientific realism is born here. So there's a really good side to this separativeness functionally, because you can make great science, you can come up with your own ideas, and you can step back and think about things.
I just qualify it's individuality as opposed to separateness, because there really is no separateness. The development of individuality.
Yes.
Right.
In a new way, in a new full way.
So I guess one of the liabilities of this development is that you think you're just your thought. You think you're just this mind.
Right. Adi Da points out, when the verbal portion of the brain becomes more or less continuous, I becomes identified with thought within. So that whole thing about truth is within is not true. Truth is, as Adi Da says, absolutely not within. There is no within. It's the illusion of self-withdrawal and being confined or attached to a verbal abstraction.
So I guess one of the liabilities of the third stage, because it's a paradoxical kind of thing. You're developing this awareness called mind, identifying it with the
self,
but also developing a sense of thought. So now there's this kind of conceptual and also development of perception and mind and thinking, and I can do this, and as the Moody Blues says, you know, the best way to travel, thinking is the best way to travel. You're just completely mind. And so, but it's objective mind, it's superficial mind, it's not higher mind, which we'll later talk about, but this is just developmenting of growth of mind and independent thinking of awareness through mind and integrated through mind, abstract. And so part of the problem of that is the attachment to that independent ability, or attachment to the mind as who you are, self, I. Because really the root of this is this illusion called me.
Right. And now it's formed as you think you're behind your eyes talking, as quoting our great rock star fans. No one knows what it's like to be the madman behind blue eyes. No one knows what it's like to be hated, to be faded, to telling only lies, because you tell only lies because you're within. There's no hole. Right. So, so that withinness is the downside, or the negative portion of this capacity to stand apart and think about things, which then becomes manipulativeness. And so you manipulate others. You're separate from others. You just take everything. Well, what's what you done for me lately, and that kind of failed, immature phase of the third stage of life is manipulative. It's certainly self-centered and narcissistic to the point of pathological.
Right.
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to get into the developmental phases here, and so one of the phases that third stage represents is a fully developed sexual character. So now we're developing the feeling dimension of the second stage into now a sexual identity, sexual character. Your male or female biology and psychology is now got to be integrated with the full sense of the human body, the human feeling, and now in the human mind as an integrated, balanced, and human way to interact in the world with others who are now developing in that same capacities there.
Right. The word you use, integration, is key here. And we could also talk about kind of the two phases, or the two aspects of the third stage. The onset, where you're developing mind, you're becoming clever, you're able to stand apart and think about something objectively, etc., etc. But then there's the second phase of it, where that cleverness becomes more discriminative, where that will, instead of I'm going to get what I want, becomes I'm going to start harmonizing. I'm going to start integrating, and like you talked about earlier, about the frontal personality. And so you're integrating the aspects of your body, harmonizing it via understanding and will. You integrate you start integrating the emotions via understanding and will. You understand so that's kind of the second phase of this developmental stage. The first phase is the onset of it, where you're more subject to the dark side of it.
Right. And an element of the third stage, a key element, which many people struggle with, is a thing called discipline.
No!
Because this independent mind and this independent feeling and this independent expansion of identity does not want to be controlled.
Yeah.
It has an infinite or seemingly infinite capacity for enjoyment, infinite capacity for pleasure, infinite capacity for all of the bodily and exploitations, but it does not want to be mastered. Mm-hmm. It does not want to be disciplined. It wants to be independent of any outside control. And there's where the key in terms of developing a third stage orientation is the self-discipline. That you now are hip to this larger force of what you're involved with here. So,
right. Because you are hip, you discriminate to the failure of your manipulative modality.
Right.
And so, as I like to point out, the third stage of life, to fulfill it or to exceed it, is never a good idea. I mean, good idea. It is a good idea, but it's not done that way. You have the master says, if we only understand the harm in which we act. And so this manipulative person, with all of its psychological and bodily, emotional dysfunctions, you see how that is not harmonized, and you see how we harm others with the compensatory aspects of our personality. So we have to turn about from that. We understand sufficiently enough to know that we're not independent like we think we want to be.
Or separate.
Or separate. And he says the childish individual wants someone to save him. The adolescent individual wants it to be fulfilled independently. Mm-hmm. He wants it all by himself. Therefore, I don't need no stinking guru is a sign of the failed adaptation of the third stage of life, because they want to do it themselves.
Or in the same way that a child will say, I do not want my parents to tell me. Because basically what third stage in this whole mind development is that you begin to see is that the struggle with parent, which is really a fundamental first stage issue here, expressing itself as you develop, is about authority. It is about knowing that there is some kind of a limit and you're not unlimited in your own separateness. And so the struggle with this is the struggle with authority, a struggle with discipline, or somebody in even your own discipline, in your own authority of discriminative intelligence. That this is the struggle. You don't want to discipline the body. You don't want to discipline the food that you're eating. You want to indulge your food. You want to indulge your feeling and sexuality.
Because you're within and separate, and so therefore the only mediation you have is by exploitation, manipulation, and you're because you've lost yourself. You're lost in your own interiority.
Right. Well, you're not even hip. You're not hip to what's going on. So you're lost in the possibilities of pleasure, the possibilities of adventure, the excitement, the thrill of life. But life has its way of reflecting back to you.
You think? And that's why, again...
And here's the problem, is that an undeveloped third stager will always, and this is the next, you could say, you are the victim. Third stage people are always, undeveloped third stage people, are always the victim. Because this kind of movement is always going to be reflected back sooner or later as a failure.
Right. I like to say we live in a time where if you can name it, which is concept, you can be irresponsible for it. Well, I'm sorry, I have a Gorgonfukel complex. You know.
Now remember, this is not just on an individual basis, because Adi Da speaks of the time in which we live is of an adolescent or third stage world development. So this kind of psychology is now on a political or a national level.
Global.
It's like, you know, the fences that people build between the geographical demarcations of where a country is and where my neighborhood is now, you're going to harm me. Well, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm going to send a diplomat out there. But yet we still have this sense of I'm the victim.
Right, and
or
this
threatened.
And historically, in the cultural geopolitical onset of this was the Declaration of Independence, and so no longer was Daddy King, King Daddy, the how we related to one another.
Second stage.
Second stage. It's the first and second stage, right. And so now they make a Declaration of Independence, and the onset of science was that same period. But the downside,
the Enlightenment,
right, quote unquote, enlightened relative to mythic and magical, yes. Right. And then the dark side of that independence, you see in the death camps of Hitler. You see this utter manipulativeness. And then we are involved. In case you don't know, notice turn on a TV. It's a teenage wasteland. It's only teenage wasteland. So our present culture is a adolescent culture, and so it's not just self. This is the culture in which we live.
Right, yeah.
And while we each may want to just exploit ourselves for the sensation of what is all pervading, it spirals down, and it becomes a wasteland, both individually and culturally. And geopolitically. Right.
So it's kind of a two-sided coin here, or a forked kind of approach, is that you must develop fully as an independent, not separate, but independent, moving away from the parenting.
Embeddedness of your childhood.
Right. And integrating into a cultural circumstance. Now, if your cultural circumstance is not fully developed in this higher wisdom teaching,
it's harder.
It's very difficult, and that's where the culture is key in any developmental phase, and where Joseph Campbell and the whole mythology of this journey that everybody must embark on and move away from the safety and the security of the family and the tribe, and you must enter into the dark forest. This is the unknown. This is the Iron John down into the bottom of the lake.
Right. The hero's journey is the going through the unconscious darkness, subconscious and unconscious darkness, where you get to see your own maladaptations.
And this is key, because what the whole reflective mechanism of the universe is that this third stage development, which tends to be objective, discriminative, the full development of the third stage is that, guess what? We're leaving the subject out here. And so this is what's shown. If you fully take that journey, at some point people don't fully take that journey and they retreat back into some kind of security. But this is what is shown as you move and integrate into a larger context. There's a subject back here who is kind of
forgotten.
The forgotten self that is this me,
right?
That independent self.
In the Vedas, we talked about earlier in the other previous talks, sessions, they said that you treat first stagers as gods. In other words, to translate that, it's a great nurturing culture. You treat the second stagers as servants. In other words, not that they have to be your slave, but rather they need to learn to put out their energy, participate energetically out from themselves. In the third stage, they say you treat your third stagers as adults. It is a time of trial adulthood. Trial meaning they will fail. So, so that's another way to frame this developmental phase. It is a period of trial adulthood. We're trying, as we actually not only develop the mind, we set it to the harmonization of the lower life, the harmonization of me and self with others and the culture. We integrate all of those. So those, it is as we should do as adults. That's what is this task of that third stage, is to be adults, to bring all the intention and understanding to bear on self, and personally, and then self with others. So and that does harmonize this, what you called earlier, this frontal personality, where then you can rest, you can let the mind be resolved in attention to what is beyond the sophomoric eye.
Right, and until that trial, because it is about, you never learn from your successes. You only learn.
What do you mean?
Well, as a basketball player, and I can't remember, maybe it was Michael Jordan said, I never learned from my successes, I only learned from my failures.
I get it.
I mean, it's only by, as Buckminster Fuller used to say, error correction, the mistake, mystique. It says life is like walking on the right foot, left foot, but it's always an era of balance. It's always a homeostasis. So you must go into imbalance to achieve balance, to walk into the world, to integrate, to speak, to integrate, to work with people.
I get it. So you become, so then you become self, separate self, I, understand, will, but then immediately you're on one foot.
Yes.
And then you have to then integrate that with others, and so you go between this dependence, independence, till you get the hang of walking then.
And compromising, and integrating, and working with instead of against, and dominating.
I see.
And
that's great.
And the era of the third stage is power.
My way or the highway.
And this is where will now becomes power. And so at a level of a baseball game, you know, I'm going to choose you. At the level of the political conference in Geneva, it's I'm going to shoot you, I'm going to dominate you, I'm going to rule the world. And it's the same psychology. It's madness if we don't get integrated into a feeling, second stage stuff, into we're connected. We're not separate, we're independent. We have independent cultures, we have independent languages, we have independent bodies, but we're not separate. We realize that in the second stage. The third stage, with discrimination as mind, now this is the culprit. This is the, if you will, the devil, because now you're the controller, and so thrown to the higher levels of mind, and you could go to madness with mind.
Or, and this is Milton's Angels, of
Right.
course, which is more of a fifth stage error, but nevertheless it's based in this. I've reached now, I am God. And he does become the devil. Right. That is how the devil arises in Christian mythology, is he takes God to be himself.
Right.
And then he's cast down. One other thing I wanted to say about, shoot, I forgot.
Okay, let's just take a break.
Stop. And you know, I heard this thing go beep.
That's that.
Oh, that's that. Okay, good. Yeah, let's take a break and look at all our notes.